I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. What if human consciousness was in fact linked up with a greater consciousness throughout the entire universe? Is it possible that there is only identity in the cosmos? Could consciousness be the key to understanding not only matter, but physical, biological life as well? And best of all, could your consciousness directly impact the structure and the health of the DNA molecule? We're going to tackle these amazing questions in this episode of Wisdom Teachings. We have been going through a really amazing re-envisioning, basically, of all the branches of science as we know them. And it's kind of embarrassing in some ways that nobody else has been able to put this together before, because the implications of what happens when we fix the mistakes of science, if you will, are enormous. Those implications include the idea that we are not living in a dead, materialistic, matter-based universe. We are ultimately living in a universe that is made of consciousness. And so the idea now is that all of reality is a projection of conscious thought. And that is a very significant point. Let's go back now for a moment to some of the points that we've brought up before, namely this idea that all of space and time is the emanation of a single geometric form. Once we start to look at this data, as I've been saying again and again, it all comes back to these scientists, Nima Arkani-Hamed and Yaroslav Trunka from Caltech, who studied quantum mechanics and found that this weird-looking shape is actually the only thing that really exists in the whole universe, that all of the universe is blossoming out of this one geometric pattern. And bear in mind, as I've said before, that since you, as you watch this, are conscious, or at least I hope you are, I think it's interesting enough that you should stay that way. As long as you are conscious, and the fact that consciousness exists, philosophically speaking, this seed that I'm talking about must be conscious. If you're conscious, and there's only one thing in the universe that made the universe, then that one thing, like a seed that the whole universe blossomed out of, that one thing must also have consciousness. And so we're looking at a conscious geometry, and that's a very important point. When we get into the esoteric material that we see from various religious teachings and spiritual teachings, this concept is consistent. The great spiritual prophets were telling us that love is the answer. They were telling us that our foundation is based upon how loving we are. And when we fall out of alignment with that love, when we fall out of this sense of forgiveness and compassion, we start to attract negativity to ourselves. We start to have karma. We start to have bad luck, seemingly mysterious random accidents and problems. I'm telling you that there's a consciousness to this universe. I'm telling you that those things that happen to you are not random. I've been dealing with analyzing karma for many years, and there's nothing random about it. I might get this little seed that gets stuck in between and it gets stuck in my teeth. And it's just because I was having an unloving thought right before then. There's so many examples of this kind of thing happening. And the idea here is the law of one, a principle of spirituality telling us that we are ultimately all emanations of this one creator, of God, if you will, whatever you choose to call it. And one way you could look at it is that it's this geometric form that is the seed of all. But really, in that sense, don't get hung up on the geometry. Think of it more as a oneness, a cluster point that gives a foundation for the whole universe to be built off of, okay? So if that's true, if this is the way things really work, then that means that we are not separate beings at all. We are unified with one another, and our sense of personality, our sense of identity, basically is an illusion. The greatest trick that the great religious teachings have told us is that we're all one mind, we're all one consciousness, we're all one identity. In fact, one could argue, and this shows up in many esoteric teachings. There is only identity in the universe. You go back to the Tibetan Buddhists, these guys who meditate for 13 years. And after 13 years, if they can have nothing but loving thoughts, no thoughts of anger, judgment, resentment, sadness, depression, oh, no big deal, right? Anybody could do that. But that's what they were working on. And if you can do that for 13 years, they literally transformed their physical bodies into the rainbow body. As I've said before, their whole body shrank down to the size of a little ashy figurine. Most of the tissue is gone. Obviously, normally, you're going to leave behind a skeleton, so this wouldn't happen. But that's not what happens to them. Their bodies shrink down as they die. It turns into ash, and they become this light body that then visits people and talks to them about things. And this is, again, very similar to what we hear, allegedly, in the story of Jesus Christ and the Ascension. So all this stuff is interrelated, and it appears that that's a pattern that we're going through, that we also are in an ascension school, that there is a reason, there is a purpose for this universe, there is a goal of what this universe's agenda is for us. In other words, we're not just here to pursue the goals that typically are told to us to be the most important things. We are here for a greater, higher initiative. We are here to reach out for a spiritual consciousness, to embrace a deeper level of love for ourselves and for others, which then apparently transforms the very nature of our being. We've talked extensively about the ancient religious prophecies of ascension. We've talked how consistently about they describe this light body activation that will happen, that our physical body turns into something made of light. We've talked about how this goes through Egyptian prophecy, Greek prophecy, and what we've done is shown how our entire solar system, with all this scientific data from NASA, is getting hotter, the sun is getting hotter and brighter, the space between the planets is getting more magnetized. We're moving into this cloud of energy. We talked about that in the galaxy, and it's actually charging up our entire solar system, making the planets very dramatically, visibly changing. Huge clouds appearing in Saturn, massive clouds appearing in Neptune, Uranus, Jupiter. Jupiter's great red spot is now a very light pale pink. This is strange stuff that has never happened before, all suggesting a scientific rationale for ascension, as the great ancient prophecies predicted. So all of this stuff being told to us by great leaders that we called gods probably suggests that they know more about the universe than we do. And what I'm trying to do now is nudge you in a direction of a greater unified scientific model. So these guys at Caltech, as I was saying, found that the universe blossomed out of a seed. And the big trick, as I keep showing you in previous episodes, is that they only got a portion of it. The Merkaba would be the whole form, and they only saw 1/4 of the Merkaba, as you see here. You can add in more tetrahedrons, which is totally excusable and actually probably makes more sense based on the science we've been talking about. And now you get your Star of David, which in 3D is going to look like this. And that is this pattern that also appears in resonance. This is a drop of water, as I've been saying, with sand in it. You vibrate the water at pure sound frequencies, and you get the same exact shape that the top scientists are now saying is the only thing that the whole universe blossomed out of. Everything is a fractal or a hologram, like a hall of mirrors off of this one shape. And again, very important, as I said in previous episodes, you can change the sound frequency. Like if you were singing a note, you could sing one note to get that frequency you see on the right, sing a different pitch, and it changes to the one on the left. So that means a vibrational change can actually change geometry. There is a direct relationship between geometry and frequency. Geometry ultimately is a projection of frequency. If you didn't do this to the water, it just looks like muddy water. It doesn't have any structure at all. It just looks cloudy and milky, but once you put that sound in, all of a sudden all the sand coheres into these beautiful geometric shapes. So that's what I'm saying the universe is doing. So we talk about in Hinduism, the universe started with the Aum, the primordial sound. In the Bible, it says the universe started with the Word. Same concept. The idea being that there is some sort of resonance that the universe started with, and there is you can't just have resonance. You need a structure for things to be built off of. Structure for suns, structure for galaxies. So this is where the structure comes from. And we've talked extensively about how this geometry is the secret of quantum physics. You see it in the atomic nucleus, you see it in the electron clouds, you see it in the way that galactic arms actually are bending geometrically, all that stuff. And then came the real bomb diggity, if you will, where we get to DNA. And DNA is following the same laws. So here again, we're showing you the double helix, and look at the red, and look at that red line starting at the bottom, and notice how the actual rungs of the double helix you've seen all your life perfectly wrap around a little totem pole stack of dodecahedrons. You can see it with the red line, and it crosses over that straight line on the little geometry there. Then you look at the green line, and you go up to the second geometry, which is now white, and sure enough, it's crossing over the line. So what I'm literally saying is you could do this at home. You could get a bunch of little dodecahedron sculptures, put them end to end, and take something like pipe cleaners and wrap it around that and make a perfect double helix that precisely geometrically describes the dodecahedron shape. And that is not just my opinion. As I've said, this is the medical doctor, Dr. Mark White, who came up with this on his own, and others have seen this as well. It is a secret to understanding what really is going on with DNA. So as I've been saying, the universe itself is built to make life. DNA is simply a resonance pattern. So when you look at those little dodecs, don't think of them as objects. Think of them as resonance patterns. Think of them as the shape of sound. That sound makes a shape. And when you create those shapes, when you create that resonance pattern, it attracts whatever is in its environment. Remember, DNA attracts all the light into itself. If you put DNA in a little room and then you shut out all the light and only a little bit of light is in there, all of that light gets sucked into the DNA. It's some kind of gravitational attraction. That's called the DNA phantom effect. So what we're really saying here is that the DNA is ultimately a resonance. It's just a frequency. Life itself is the word of the Creator. It is the Aum. It is the primordial sound. It is the identity of the universe. It's consciousness. DNA is a projection of consciousness into matter caused by frequency. And there are actually some really, really stunning ways that we can prove this. And we'll get to that in just a second. Now, we also talked about not only does DNA do this, but the actual genetic code did this. And you remember Dr. Mark White's diagram, as we're showing you here, of the 20 different basic amino acids that all proteins are made out of. They correspond to the 20 corners of this dodecahedron shape. And then in the middle there, you have A, C, G, and U. Those are the 4 basic nucleotides that all DNA in the messenger RNA part is made of, okay? So you only have 4. That's why you see the 4 letters. And then you have 20 corners of the geometry, which are the 20 basic amino acids. And this is all scientifically proven. There's only 20 that all life is made from. And you remember this. This is coming right off of Dr. Mark White's site. And this, again, is a guy with an MD. He really knows his stuff. It's very complex. He said there is a suitable relationship between a dodecahedron and a tetrahedron. Remember, the tetrahedron is those 4 nucleotides put together in a triangle like that. And this relationship between the dodec and the tetrahedron is identical to the relationship between nucleotides and amino acids. What are the odds? Well, this is really trippy stuff. And again, the part that people don't really seem to be getting, and I'm not criticizing them, you get some guys like Dr. Mark White, and he sees the geometry in the genetic code. He sees how all of this stuff that nobody's been able to solve since 1968, they know certain amino acids get along, certain amino acids don't get along, certain amino acids like water, certain amino acids don't. And all of that stuff doesn't really make sense. You put it in a big flat graph, whatever. But once you map it out this way, once you see that life itself all fits together, the proteins all fit together geometrically, wow. It's like now you say, well, wait a minute, that means life is a projection of resonance. Because this geometry isn't really a solid object, it's just a wave that is created whenever you make sound. So theoretically, this means that you could actually create life or modify life with sound frequency. And then let's take it a step further. What if, as I said before, the seed that the universe is made of is all there is, right? That all of the universe blossomed out of one geometry? What if that one geometry is consciousness? It is awareness. And what if you, by being conscious, actually do have access to the raw power of creation? What if you create with your thoughts? What if your thoughts directly impact reality, and if you can generate enough strength of intent and willpower, and actually it has to be kicked with the heart as well. Without the heart, it doesn't seem to work. What if you could actually modify the world around us? Because remember, we're dealing in this Cartesian universe. Rene Descartes tried to say it's all matter, it's all material, it's all dead. Wait a minute. If the matter is conscious, if the matter is a projection of consciousness, right? If it's a frequency, and you're conscious, then why couldn't you project that consciousness? Why couldn't you levitate something with your mind? Why couldn't you create something out of thin air, just like the great masters appear to have done? Well, because DNA is so susceptible to this, DNA has that dodecahedron shape, it has that resonance in it, maybe people already can affect DNA with their consciousness and it just hasn't been studied yet. Or has it? And this brings us to Dr. Glenn Ryan, who ultimately made a discovery about toroidal DNA that we will get into maybe in this episode. As I'm talking, I might not have time, but we'll see if we can get there. Now, here's Dr. Glenn Ryan. I've met up with him. I've talked to him at various conferences. I actually interviewed him a long time ago. And he has done some of the most amazing, groundbreaking genetics research that I've ever seen. And here he is in the lab. And you're going to see in a minute why his research is so amazing. I just want to toss in a little extra here about reincarnation, because as you see in this next picture, there is an uncanny similarity between Dr. Glenn Ryan and Einstein. And I don't think this is an accident. We've talked about Dr. Ian Stevenson, who interviewed 3,000 different children in the Middle East mostly, who were able to remember or claimed to remember that they had past lives. Ian Stevenson was able to forensically check what those kids said. Some of the kids remembered names, places, faces. Some of the kids remembered being murdered, and they actually solved the murder mystery, and the murderers confessed. Time and time again, these children remembered details that could be verified and could be proven to be accurate. And the really weird part is that the kids matched in their faces the people that they remembered being before. They looked very, very similar. And this is very consistent. And now we have Dr. Jim Tucker, who's actually using forensic police face matching software on these reincarnation cases, and finding that when people remember accurate details from another life, if you can find a picture of the original person, they look almost the same, enough that you could be charged with the crime that you committed in your past life. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if we're looking at DNA as just a bunch of molecules, right? If it's just a chunk of matter, your parents gave you your DNA, right? You got your dad's DNA, your mom's DNA, that's it. But wait a minute. If DNA is a waveguide, right? If DNA is made out of this geometric vibration, and the geometry just shows you vibration in a solid, it's not really a solid, then what if the soul has a face? What if your face is the face of your soul? And when your soul interfaces with your body, it sculpts your face to look like who you are in this greatest sense. There's tons of examples of face matches with reincarnation cases. And so I say this in all seriousness. I really do think that Dr. Glenn Ryan is the reincarnation of Dr. Einstein. And Einstein's work was perverted. Einstein created a beautiful model of space and time working together as a single whole in what he called the fabric of space-time. But that same knowledge was used to build the most devastating technology in human history, the nuclear bomb. And so wouldn't it be cool if Einstein wanted to come back again and this time create something that no matter how that science was used, it could never be creating harm for others? What would happen if a genius at the level of Einstein could reincarnate, come back again, and pick exactly what he wants to do and design that life to make sure that he's going to make a huge contribution and that it can't be used to hurt people? Well, that's what I think Dr. Glenn Ryan has done here. And you'll know more about why I'm saying this when we get into his actual study. So let's take a look at this. He's saying to us that love itself, the energy of love, can directly affect DNA. And this is the paper from 1996. He'd already written it when I spoke to him and interviewed him back then. The effect of conscious intention on human DNA. That's pretty heavy right there. Now I'm going to read you some of this stuff, and it is really mind-blowing. So what he's doing, I'm just kind of hitting the ground running here, but let's just kind of read from here. You'll get the gist of it. By removing DNA from a body, and he'll say in a minute here that it came from placenta. This is important. Placentas are thrown away after a birth, so it's a totally non-confrontational way to get genetic samples, right? It's just wasted otherwise. So they took DNA from multiple placentas. Now this is somebody else's DNA. And then they have certain individuals who are trained in generating this resonance, this heart frequency that he talks about, the energy of love. What happens if you direct your energy, if you direct your feelings of love or hatred towards somebody else's DNA? Not yours, but somebody else's. That's what this experiment that we're going to read about is saying. So let's take a look at this. By removing the DNA from the body and placing it in a beaker in front of an individual intending to change the DNA, it was possible to measure a direct energetic link between heart-focused intention and the DNA molecule. This is amazing. Without any intervening chemical signals coming from the nervous system within the body. Now he's going to explain to us exactly how this works, because what's happening is DNA is like a zipper. So in order for DNA to be useful to you, it has to unzip. You have this double helix, it wraps around itself. In order for the messenger RNA to get in there and grab little pieces of information and code to use it in order to tell the body what to do, the DNA has to unzip and unwind. So the unwinding of DNA, like unzipping a zipper, is a very important part of biological processes. And he explains that in this paper, but he does it in a really technical way. I'm trying to make it a little simpler. So you have to understand here that there's something about that dodecahedron now where the frequency changes and it expands, it widens. And as it widens, it's going to open up the double helix. It's going to open up the DNA so that the code can be accessed. So what this also means, though, is that as DNA actually unwinds, it has satisfied its mission. It dies. You can't zip it back up necessarily, or at least normally you wouldn't be expected to. So when DNA is coalesced, when it's in that dodecahedron shape, the DNA is alive, and in scientific terms, when the DNA unwinds, it is now dead. Typically, it doesn't wind back up. So what he's actually looking at is, can human beings wind and unwind DNA? Could, for example, a person take DNA that is partially unwound and zip it back together? And the answer actually is yes. This is what's so amazing. Human consciousness, human love, having a direct effect on the zipping or unzipping of DNA, which makes sense if we're seeing that the resonance is what holds that DNA in place, and you change the resonance with your consciousness. So let's get back into this now and read more of what he's saying here. A direct link between consciousness and DNA. Although human DNA was used in these experiments, it was a pooled sample from the placenta of many individuals. It is likely that even larger effects would be seen if the subject, in this case the person sending the energy, was directing their intention to their own DNA. But to me, actually, I think it's even more provocative that you can change somebody else's DNA. Because as we're going to see here, you can kill somebody else's DNA. You can harm it. You can cause it to unravel, which is causing death in the body. You could kill other people's tissues just by sending directed negative energy to them, and it's laboratory proven. And the science on this is absolutely bulletproof. So let's keep reading and I'll show you how this works. These experiments measured the winding and unwinding of the two strands which make up the DNA double helix, also referred to, this is just the geek speak term now, as conformational changes in the secondary structure of DNA. Okay, fair enough. Unwinding of DNA precedes the dividing of a cell, among other things. It also accesses the genetic code. And winding of DNA is associated with DNA repair. And I guess in certain cases, DNA can be repaired. It's not like all unwound DNA is dead. And that is a good point too, which is that DNA naturally has to unravel to make two cells. So in cell division, the DNA unwinds and then it repairs itself and comes back into a double-strand DNA as the one cell becomes two cells. But when you read this paper, he also talks about the idea that unwound DNA is dead and wound DNA is alive. So let's keep reading. A UV spectrophotometer, we're going to see that in just a second, from Hewlett-Packard, was used to measure the winding and unwinding of DNA. This is a standard biochemical technique based on the fact that DNA absorbs ultraviolet light at 260 nanometers. So this is important, very important actually. I talked to you about the DNA phantom effect, how if you put DNA in a room that's very dark and there's just a little bit of light in there, that all of the light, all the photons, get sucked into the DNA. Well, this optical quality of DNA is how geneticists test to see if a DNA is alive or dead. And the ideal ultraviolet light frequency, the frequency of those photons that works the best, is 260 nanometers. So when DNA is wound up and alive, it's going to have light in it at 260 nanometers, and they can detect that by counting how much light is in the DNA with this spectrophotometer from Hewlett-Packard. If the DNA unwinds and is dead, then there's not as much light in it, and when they look at it with the spectrophotometer, it's not going to have the same amount of light in it. So that's the key. That's what you need to see here. It was demonstrated that DNA in deionized water was stable when it was kept at room temperature for 2 hours. This is important because that just means that when you have the DNA in the water, we know it's stable, meaning it's going to have the same amount of light in it. It's not like it's dying. It's not like the light is going to disappear over 2 hours. It stays consistent. You check it with this machine over the course of 2 hours, and it holds exactly the same amount of light in it. It's not leaking light, and it's not absorbing light. It stays the same. So let's take a look at this machine. Now, I'm not sure if this is the one that he was using or not, but this is an example of a high-technology spectrophotometer from Hewlett-Packard. So you notice there's test tubes on the right there, and in those test tubes you would have your sample, in this case from the placenta of those donor mothers. You take that placental tissue that has DNA in it, and you stick it in the area between the two boxes. And you'll notice there's a little metallic thing there, like a little stage, almost like a microscope plate. And you stick the tissue sample in there, and then what it's doing is it's actually drilling down on it microscopically and counting photons at a very, very, very tiny level. And then it sends them into a computer. So here again is that same particular Hewlett-Packard machine with the computer readout that it has next to it, where it's actually counting how many photons are there and where those photons are located. That's the key. So the readout is giving you an active diagram of how much light is in your sample. It's a spectrophotometer. It is counting the light in your sample. So this is the setup. This is what we then have people working in front of this machine, working on that tissue sample and changing the optical properties of the sample. So what could happen, for example, is you have this sample of tissue, you put it in the machine, you check how much light is in it, you take it out, you have somebody send their energy to it, and then you put it back in the machine again. Really simple, right? All of mainstream science would tell you there is no way that the amount of light in that DNA should have changed. But that's not what happens. Let's take a look. Initial experiments were done with Leonard Laskow, who used a combination of directed intention, unconditional love, and specific imagery of the DNA molecule at the molecular and atomic level, often focusing on the hydrogen bonds which hold the two strands together. So he's literally visualizing, trying to wind and unwind DNA. He's even looking at the hydrogen holding the two rungs of the DNA together. Well, wait a minute. Who is Leonard Laskow? This is Leonard Laskow. And he's not just anybody. He's actually a prominent researcher who has focused on, as his book is called, Healing with Love. And you can see there he's got a medical doctorate. He's an MD, and it says the art and science of healing yourself and others through love and grace. So he is one of the people in this institute that's called the Institute of Heart Math that Dr. Glenn Ryan has worked for. And Leonard Laskow was able to set this intention to wind or unwind DNA in the lab. And he's doing this in his mind, but then let's see, did it work? Did anything actually happen when he did this? These experiments revealed that different intentions produced different effects on the DNA molecule. That's a very important point, causing it to either wind or unwind. And this is really significant because Laskow wasn't just loving the DNA and making it heal. He could send anger and hate to the DNA and cause it to unwind. He could kill the DNA. And so this is one of the examples of how this actually works. And it says here, these results were later confirmed in an extensive series of experiments done at the Institute of Heart Math. So that's all the time we have in this episode, and it's actually taking me longer to work through this than I thought it would, but that's okay. In the next episode, we're going to be going into the toroidal aspect of DNA, the hidden explanation that seems to be underlying what this phenomenon really is. And we're also going to see how that relates to the idea of ascension, that there could be a frequency change in our solar system taking place right now that could very well be winding our DNA into a whole new genetic structure, causing us to evolve into something more than we have ever been before. I'm David Wilcock. This is Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.